Everyone, welcome. It's great to see a lot of you here. Some of you are very familiar and a lot of new faces as well. So this is the kickoff seminar for the College of Health and Social Services in our new official first time series of seminars. And we're grateful to the Partnership for the Advancement of Cancer Research for helping us sponsor this event. I'm Jill McDonald. I'm the Associate Dean for Research and Community Engagement at the College of Health and Social Services. And before we introduce our speaker, I just want to make three announcements quickly. The first one is that we are recording the seminar. And as soon as we can get the link to the seminar on our website, we will do that. We'll also have our speaker slides there available for you to review. We'd like you to feel free to jot down questions in the chat line whenever they occur to you. And at the end of the presentation, we will alternate between taking questions from the chat line and then calling on those of you who have your hands raised to ask a question. And lastly, we'd really like some feedback from all of you before you leave the seminar. It's going to help us in planning for future college seminars. It's a very brief survey, just a few questions before you leave. If you go back to that chat line, go up to the top, we have the link there to the survey. So just whenever you leave, please do that chat line link, answer the questions, and we'll be very appreciative. And now I'm going to turn it over to our Dean, Sonia Cooper, who will introduce our speaker.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our first College of Health and Social Services seminar series with our special inaugural speaker, Dr. Marian Neuhouser. As Jill McDonald said, I'm Sonia Cooper. I'm the interim dean for the College of Health and Social Services. We were actually looking forward to kicking this off, the first college level seminar in person last spring. With Dr. Neuhouser, but we postponed due to COVID and we didn't want to hold it off anymore. So here we are. Dr. Neuhouser's field of expertise is closely aligned with the college's research interests, and we are honored to have her with us today to talk about assessing diet in our complex food system. Dr. Neuhouser is the program head of the Cancer Prevention Program in the Public Health Sciences Division at the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center in Seattle, Washington. She is also a faculty member in the graduate program in Nutritional Sciences and an affiliate faculty member in the Department of Epidemiology at the University of Washington School of Public Health. She is a nutritional epidemiologist focused on the role that certain lifestyle factors such as diet, physical activity, and energy balance have in the etiology and prevention of cancers such as breast and prostate cancer and other chronic diseases. Dr. Neuhouser focuses on ways to improve dietary and physical activity measurements among participants in diet-related studies, and has led or co-led many small-scale and large-scale studies, including observational studies and clinical trials. Her studies have focused on minority and elderly populations and populations experiencing health disparities. Dr. Neuhouser has authored over 300 peer-reviewed publications and a dozen book chapters related to cancer prevention, dietary assessment methods, the impact of diets, and the impact of diets on health. And if I were to go over everything that Dr. Neuhouser did, I would be here for an hour talking to you instead of Dr. Neuhouser. So I am going to turn it over, and we are just so happy to have you, Dr. Neuhouser, and excited to hear your topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Cooper and Dr. McDonald. Going to share my screen now and hope that it works. Okay, are we good?
I believe so, yes.
Okay. As As was mentioned, I'll be speaking to you today about assessing diet in our complex food system. And first, I want to thank you for inviting me. This is a tremendous partnership between the University of Washington and New Mexico State University. And I wish I could teleport myself to be there in person. I was really looking forward to being together with you, but I guess, we're all doing the best we can in this new environment. But I want to thank you for this honor to be with you today. And here are my disclosures. I have funding from the National Institutes of Health, and that's it. So a big overarching question is to think about, why are we interested in diet and disease risk? Why does it matter? Well, this slide is from a collaboration called the Global Burden of Diseases collaboration that's run out of the University of Washington. And what this worldwide map is showing is all of the deaths that are due to diet and diet-related risks just from 1 year, from 2017. The areas of the map that are orange and red have the highest numbers of deaths. So this is numbers per 100,000 people in the population. So across, many parts of Asia, Eastern Europe, Africa, the South Pacific, Southeast Asia, very high number of global deaths due to diet-related factors. But even in North and South America, there are also way too many deaths due to diet-related factors. And it's not just deaths that is a problem, but there's also a loss of economic productivity, high healthcare costs, and low quality of life. So it's really an important health problem. So pre-COVID, because we know that this past year, in 2020, COVID-19 was a leading cause of death. But pre-COVID, in the United States alone, the major chronic diseases are cardiovascular disease, and that includes just many subtypes, various types of stroke, heart failure, myocardial infarction, type 2 diabetes, and cancer, the most common of which are lung, breast, colorectal, prostate, and recent increases in both pancreas and liver cancers. Half of all of Americans have one or more chronic disease risk factors: obesity, hypertension, hyperlipidemia, and so forth, putting them at high risk for these diseases. It's important to remember that a lot of this is preventable. Obesity, hypertension, hyperlipidemia, most of that is preventable through lifestyle factors. So here we see the trends in obesity prevalence among adults between 1976 and 2016, so a 20-year period. And you can see this sharp rise in obesity for both males and females, so that by the time 2016 ended, and that was just 5 years ago, 42% of all women and 39% of all men were obese, meaning that they had a body mass index greater than 30 and substantially increasing their risks of poor health. Obesity is now linked with 13 cancers, and that's shown here on this infographic. And it ranges from common cancers such as colon and rectum, breast, to rare cancers, multiple myeloma, meningioma, gallbladder. A lot of those are rare cancers, but there still are links to obesity. So most of this, again, is preventable. This is a slide showing the population attributable fractions to new cancer cases due to high BMI. So globally, for men, it's up at the top in the blue, and for women down the bottom in the red. So the darker the color, the higher the population attributable fraction of new cancer cases due to BMI. So what that means is, if we took away that risk, if we took away high BMI, those cancer cases would disappear. So these are the ones that we can reasonably say with some certainty that there's a near causal association of obesity with new cancer cases. So how does diet play into this? The role of diet and nutrition in disease risk is complicated, and that's because diet is complex. Within our diets, we have 3 macronutrients, and what that means is that those are the nutrients that we get calories from: protein, carbohydrate, and fat. We also get calories from alcohol, but not much nutrition, so that's why it's set off a little bit. We have micronutrients that we don't get calories from, but vitamins and minerals play key roles as cofactors for enzymes, as structural parts of different proteins. So those are needed by the diet. We have fiber, which is not technically a nutrient, but it is important for human health. We have phytochemicals, which are not considered essential nutrients at this time, but they're important for health, and they include flavonoids, carotenoids, polyphenols, isoflavones. And fruit also contains contaminants such as pesticides, herbicides, nitrosamines, pathogens, and on and on. So I know that many of you are bench scientists and spend most of your workday at the bench. So I just want to remind everyone that even though we eat food and nutrients, those nutrients go into really key biological reactions. There's very little that our bodies can make themselves. For instance, we cannot make protein. We have to get it from the diet. We cannot make vitamins and minerals. We have to get that from the diet. So what we eat goes into these key biological reactions. Diet is multidimensional and complex. As I mentioned a moment ago, we have sets of nutrients, and then we have something called constituents, which are important compounds, but they're not necessarily nutrients per se. You may have heard of many of these. They're mostly plant compounds: resveratrol, genistein, quercetin, isoflavones, curcumin, catechins. We have foods. We have foods as eaten. And that's important to think about, because something like pizza, tacos, burgers, those are mixtures made of lots of different things. So how do we think about those in terms of assessment? Do we assess them as a whole, or do we break them down into their constituents? So you can see that very quickly it gets complicated. Then we have food groups, as you can see here: fruits, vegetables, and so forth. And then other attributes such as the pesticides, toxins, and pathogens. So you can see that it gets very complicated. In addition, diet is also taste, enjoyment, family and friends, health of the planet, availability, familiarity. You can't eat what you don't have available to you to purchase or to grow. It's also culture, celebrations and holidays, stress and emotions. Some people eat more when they're stressed, some people eat less. And certainly we have all experienced a lot of stress in the last year. And it's also a marker of health equity, especially food insecurity. So there's all of these aspects to think about and assess as well. So what do we measure? We have foods, nutrients, dietary patterns, or what I would call various types of behaviors, food insecurity. Well, what you want to measure will really depend on the research question. Some things to think about are that about 100 years ago was when nutrition science first started out as its own discipline. And it was mostly concerned with deficiencies. We had a model of one nutrient for one disease, perhaps more than one disease. For example, vitamin A, it was first discovered because it was found to play a role in vision and night blindness, and provision of vitamin A in the diet virtually made these problems go away. Iron, to this day, is still very well known for iron deficiency anemia, even though it has many other functions in the body. And vitamin D was discovered also about 100 years ago for its role in preventing rickets and its subsequent role in bone health. Thinking about that role of these single nutrients related to deficiencies, the DRI, or the dietary reference intakes, and the RDAs, recommended dietary allowances, they are mostly built on preventing deficiencies. So when you read a nutrition facts food label, when you see information about nutrition, those are what we call the DRIs, and those amounts are to prevent deficiencies. So the amount of iron that is recommended across the lifespan is to prevent iron deficiency anemia. The amount of vitamin D is for its role in bone health. An intervention or any study that's focused on nutrient deficiencies should appropriately assess the target nutrient, especially in low resource settings. So just as an example, iron deficiency anemia is still a big problem in many parts of the world, particularly in pregnant women and young children, and not treating iron deficiency anemia can have long-term health effects. So that's an example of where targeting a very specific nutrient where there is a deficiency is appropriate. But what about what else should we measure? And as was mentioned in the introduction, I've done a lot of work in nutrition over the last 25 years, but I'm only going to be able to focus on 2 things today. Otherwise, you'll have to take my course at the University of Washington. But first, I'm going to focus a little bit on dietary patterns because it may have a little bit more relevance to chronic disease risk. And then behaviors, because I do think that food-related behaviors, how people eat, when they eat, and food insecurity are important to weave into any type of dietary assessment. So I'm going to give these 2 examples and talk about how they've been useful in research. So first, I want to talk a little bit about dietary patterns and diet quality. Excuse me. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, studying single nutrients, particularly in deficiency situations, is completely appropriate for certain research questions. For chronic disease and for obesity research, most of the recent evidence suggests that no single food has all the nutrients needed for health, especially for chronic disease prevention. And people eat foods, not nutrients. So the way we think about dietary patterns is that they are the totality of foods and beverages consumed in the diet and the frequency with which they are consumed. And the idea is that the whole is more than the sum of its parts. So you can see people eat combinations of things. So what do they eat day in and day out? That's a dietary pattern. There are different methods to derive dietary patterns. There's data-driven approaches where investigators will use self-reported diets in a study group, and they'll use statistical methods called factor analysis or cluster analysis to see what types of foods might cluster together in a pattern. There's investigator-driven approaches, and this is where there's preset ways to score a diet. And I'll talk a little bit more about how to do that in the next few slides. This is by far the most common, to use these a priori diet quality indices to evaluate a diet of a person or a population. And then there are some hybrid approaches that use something called a reduced rank regression. But using these investigator-driven approaches is definitely the most common. So how do we estimate dietary patterns in a study? So typically what happens is investigators like myself, we will take these self-reported instruments such as food records or food frequency questionnaires or 24-hour dietary recalls, and points are awarded for consumption of certain foods such as whole grains, lean protein, fruits, vegetables, and so forth. But points are not awarded for consumption of refined grains, certain fats, red and processed meat, and added sugars. And those are just examples. And then the points are summed across all of those. And the more points, the better the diet quality. A caveat to think about with this approach is that these diet quality indices that just evaluate if someone eats a certain food, they often ignore the portion size, they don't consider total calories, and they don't consider foods consumed together, frequency of meals, snacks per day, and behavioral aspects of eating. So there are some limitations to these dietary patterns. So I'll just give you a couple of examples for how we do this. So this is just an example of how someone might fill out a food record. So maybe they had some regular tortilla chips. Well, that wouldn't count in a healthy dietary pattern. But the salsa would be a portion of a vegetable serving. The Minute Maid lemonade, that's not considered fruit juice, so that wouldn't count. In fact, it would probably count as added sugars, so that would be points that would be docked. Same with the cookies. The beef stew, we would have to parse out how much beef there is, vegetables, and so forth, and so on down the line. We can also use food frequency questionnaires, and on most FFQs, the foods are grouped. So you can see here is the cereals, bread, snacks. This FFQ has another section where it lists fruits and vegetables, another with beverages, another with meats, and then combination foods. And when people fill these out, when they are in studies, they bubble in whether or not they eat the food, how often. So it ranges from never or less than once a month to 2 or more times a day, and then has a serving size. For most of the diet quality indices, this is what's used, the frequency of consumption, but the portion size sometimes is used, sometimes is not used. It may depend on the research study. So there are 4 very well used dietary pattern indices. These are the most common. So the DASH eating plan is based on the DASH randomized controlled trial. And that DASH stands for Dietary Approaches to Stop Hypertension. That was a randomized controlled trial testing a high grain, low fat dairy, lean protein, and plentiful fruit and vegetable diet to lower hypertension in at-risk people. It was an extremely successful intervention. So because of that, there has been built this DASH eating plan. The next one is the Healthy Eating Index that some of you may have heard of. And the Healthy Eating Index reflects how well someone follows the dietary guidelines. So every 5 years, by US law, there's a group of scientists who provide a scientific report to the Department of Health and Human Services and Department of Agriculture that suggests how people should be eating. And then the USDA takes that report and produces a policy document that is then disseminated to the public. And that document is called the US Dietary Guidelines. So the Healthy Eating Index is a score of how well someone's diet is aligned with those guidelines. The Mediterranean Diet Score is based on some eating patterns of the Mediterranean region. Its scoring system is quite different from the others. It's mostly based on consumption of legumes, low-fat dairy, whole grains, and they actually have an alcohol component in there as well. You get points for consuming red wine, for example. And then the alternative Healthy Eating Index is very similar to the HEI. It just has a few tweaks, and that was created by Harvard researchers. Some of the other dietary pattern indices that are out there include the Inflammatory Dietary Index, the Plant-Based Diet Index, the Nordic Diet, the MIND Diet, the American Cancer Society Score, and if you pick up any nutrition journal, you'll see other dietary pattern indices. But they're all similar in that typically the self-reported diet, typically from an FFQ, but can be from some other instruments, are awarded the points or not awarded points by what I showed on the previous slides. So this is comparing the HEI from 2010. It's been updated with the 2015, but there really were not a lot of changes to the points awarded. They've not yet created an HEI 2020, even though the 2020 guidelines have been issued. HEI 2010, Mediterranean, and DASH. This row shows the total number of points that can be awarded. So the higher the number of points, the higher the diet. And again, you can see that AMED has a limited number of points, just 9. So where you see a plus sign, that is where points are awarded in each one of these diet systems. So you can see that nuts is not a component of HEI, but it is a component of the others. Legumes is a component of AMED, but not the others. Fish is only a component of 2, and so on. And then down here, points are not awarded for consumption of red and processed meat across 3 of these. Refined grains, you're only docked under HEI 2010, and then sugar sweetened beverages and sodium. So that's how they compare. I like showing this slide. This is from some colleagues at the National Cancer Institute who shared this with me. And it really shows the importance of diet quality, and it's not just calories. And this is not just for studies of obesity or weight reduction, but it applies to all studies of diet and health. So as I mentioned, the higher the number of points, the better quality diet. So all of these, excuse me, that you can see here, they're all 2,000 calories, but they have a wide range of diet quality. So let's look down here at the poor diet. If someone had an HEI score of 27, that would be a pretty poor quality diet. And so you can see here for breakfast, it's some kind of sugar sweetened cereal and some coffee. For lunch, it's some chips, a sugar sweetened beverage, a sandwich, looks like it's made with white bread and maybe some processed meat. For snack, it's a donut and some more coffee. And then for dinner, something white. I don't know if it's chicken or if it's fish, but it's something, looks like maybe macaroni and cheese and some corn. So together, this is considered a poor quality diet. For the same number of calories, 2,000, you really can have an excellent diet. There's fruit. We hope this is a whole grain cereal, some whole grain bread, a sandwich, some fruit, whole grain bread, milk, afternoon snack, fruit, and a yogurt. And then for dinner, we see more vegetables here and some lean protein. So I just like showing this because it's not just calories, it's the overall quality of the diet that's important. So I'm going to show you a little bit of how we have applied some of these dietary pattern analyses in the Women's Health Initiative. And in case you're not familiar with the Women's Health Initiative, it's the largest study that's ever been done on women's health. It started in 1993, and it recruited over 161,000 postmenopausal women throughout the United States at 40 different clinical research centers. Women could enroll in either 1, 2, or 3 clinical trials, hormone therapy, dietary modification, or a supplement of calcium plus vitamin D, or they could enroll in an observational study if they weren't eligible for the trials or if they didn't want to have the burden of being in a trial. The trials ended in 2005 and everyone converted over to an observational study. And still today, we are collecting outcomes and adjudicating those with medical records and Medicare claims data. Women are also mailed a questionnaire each year to update things about, are you still driving, sleep habits, and this year, of course, they were asked a lot of questions about COVID. So in 2021, we still have 65,000 women who remain enrolled and participating, and many of those are over 100 years old. They are really an amazing group. So we were interested in diet quality and mortality, And we did this first analysis using data from the observational cohort. So that was over 93,000 women. We used their food frequency questionnaires, but eliminated FFQs where the total calories were less than 600 or more than 5,000 calories a day. We eliminated women from the analysis who had prior cardiovascular disease or cancer, because that was going to be our endpoint for mortality. And then we also eliminated women who did not have complete information on diabetes. So that left us with a little over 63,000 for this particular analysis. And then we calculated these diet quality scores that I mentioned: healthy eating index, alternative healthy eating index, the Mediterranean diet, and the DASH scores using the WHI FFQ. We used Cox proportional hazards models, and then we estimated the hazard ratio and the 95% confidence intervals for death, controlling for a number of important covariates. So what we found was that for all-cause mortality, for CVD mortality, and for cancer, the better the diet, there was a lower risk of death. And this was true. It was pretty consistent across all of these ways to assess diet quality. And it was remarkably consistent. So what this is showing is the top quintile of the diet quality, or the best diets compared to the poorest diets. You know, on average, for all types of mortality, there was anywhere between about a 14 to 18% reduced risk of mortality, total mortality. And for cardiovascular disease, we also observed same, very similar magnitude of reduced risk for mortality. And then also for cancer, the only one that didn't show a reduced risk for cancer was this AHEI index. And even today, we haven't been able to figure out why that particular one did not show a reduced risk for cancer mortality, but the others did. So that was pretty remarkable. We did this analysis in some other cohorts as well. The AARP cohort, which is led by NCI, and the multi-ethnic cohort. And we found very similar results in all three of those cohorts. We were also interested in whether or not it differed by BMI status. So it was not surprising that women with a normal BMI at less than 25, that they would still have a reduced risk of all-cause mortality by these diet quality indices. But what was surprising to us was that even for women who were overweight and obese, if they had a really good quality diet in the top quintile of the distribution, they had a reduced risk for all-cause mortality. It started to creep up towards the null value for women who were obese at the time that this was done. But seeing this was really quite remarkable, that even for women who are in the overweight group, having a really good quality diet did help them maintain longevity. We then more recently did an analysis, and this one was led by Linda Van Horn at Northwestern University, where we wanted to look at the dietary pattern scores in the dietary modification trial instead of in just the observation. So the dietary modification trial was a behavioral intervention where women were encouraged to consume about 20% of their calories from fat, consume a high number of fruits and vegetables each day, and also whole grains. And on average, the intervention lasted about 8.5 years. There was a rolling enrollment, so that's why I say on average. So we took some of the dietary assessment instruments that women completed while they were on the trial, and we looked to see how well they mirrored some of these same diet quality indices. So the HEI, the DASH, the AHEI, and the AMED. And what we found, what this graph is telling us, is that the ones that are in the blue, these favored the intervention and showed that the WHI dietary modification trial closely aligned with some of these scores. And these results are for women without hypertension at the beginning of the trial. And the reason that we use that for this particular analysis is some of the medications and other risk factors for hypertension were confounding some of the associations. So you can see that as expected, women who had, a lot of sodium or oils and so forth, they did not fare so well. But this was encouraging to us that the dietary modification trial intervention mirrored some of these healthy diets. And the outcomes here are for incident cardiovascular disease, and we're showing some very beneficial effects. So now I'm going to turn and talk a little bit about dietary behaviors, the second topic I told you I was going to cover today. So what do dietary behaviors mean? What is it? And why should we be interested in this? So it's a whole host of different types of things to think about. It's how many times do people eat a day? In other words, what is the frequency of eating? Do they snack all day? Or do they eat, 2 meals a day, 3 meals a day? When do people eat? There's a lot of interesting work going on right now with clock time and circadian rhythms and how that interfaces with eating patterns and health. What about meal skipping? Do people routinely skip meals, or do they occasionally skip meals? And does that influence health? Where do they eat? In other words, are they eating in front of their computer, TV, or are they sitting down with friends, family members? Who do they eat with? How do they think about food? Is food a reward? Is a food just something they have to get out of the way because they know they have to eat? Other behaviors and habits, such as routine salting of food at the table. And then what do they do when they're eating? Is it screen time? Is it something else? And then the topic I'm going to cover in the next few slides is access to food barriers and food insecurity. So these are all dietary behaviors that I think are really important. I obviously won't be able to cover all of those today, so I'm just going to cover the last one. Food insecurity, as we all know, even before COVID-19, has been a persistent problem around the world and has been accentuated by COVID-19. In 2020, the Nobel Peace Prize was awarded to the UN World Food Program in recognition for their efforts to envision a world without hunger, famine, or malnutrition. So I thought that was quite remarkable when that was announced in October of 2020. So food insecurity really is recognized as an important problem in the US and globally. So a few years ago, I was interested in food access and food security among the elderly. So we're going to talk again about the Women's Health Initiative. So food, nutrition, and food access in the elderly really is an important problem. It can be hard for the elderly to physically shop and cook because they're frail. Many of them are isolated, and this is even more so with COVID. Many of them have spouses and friends who may have passed on. Their adult children and family may not live in close proximity, so they're very isolated. They may have limited financial resources, especially if they have a small pension or are living on Social Security alone. Many of our elderly family members and friends take medications that decrease appetite. Many of them have chronic conditions that make it hard to chew and swallow. With age, we have decreased peristalsis, and that's the small muscle movements throughout the GI tract that move our food along and help us to swallow and digest. There's decreased peristalsis with age. There's very well-known declines in taste and smell. And then there's a lot of swallowing difficulties because there's general lower muscle tone, decreased saliva production, and some of that can even be accentuated after a stroke. So malnutrition in the elderly is really very common. And it's not just in the hospitalized elderly or those in nursing homes. In a lot of free living, community dwelling elders is very common. So I was interested in finding out more about this and if it was a problem in the Women's Health Initiative. So every year, women are sent a form by mail where they answer questions. And this particular year, there were questions about current weight, friends, and so forth. And the questions vary a little bit from year to year. There's kind of a long process to figure out what questions are going to be asked. As I mentioned at the beginning, COVID figured prominently in the 2020 questionnaire. Well, there was one year that I and a few others were able to persuade the powers that be to ask some questions about eating habits and food access in the WHI women. So these were the questions we were able to ask. Whether or not they ate 2 or fewer meals a day, they ate alone most of the time, yes or no, tooth or mouth problems making it hard to eat, I'm not always able to physically shop and cook and feed for myself, and don't have enough money to buy the food I need. And these questions were based on a previous instrument called the Nutrition Screening Initiative. Sometimes it's called the Determined Checklist. And that was published back in 1993. But we were just really interested in seeing how these food behaviors and even food insecurity, especially not having enough money to buy food, influence the women's health. So we did this study in something called the WHI Long Life Study. You already saw the slides about the clinical trial and the observational study. Well, it's around 2012, 2013, there was a study called the Long Life Study, and you can see the numbers down here, almost 8,000 women distributed across these groups you can see here on the slide, and they had a home visit. And at the home visit, there was a blood draw, vital signs, blood pressure, height and weight, circumference, weight, and then they did these measures of functional status. And this was all done in the participant's home. And the reason that they did the measures of functional status is that there's well-known strong associations of poor functional status with mortality, especially in the elderly. So they, all women who'd had this home visit did something called a grip strength measure. And it's a device called a hand dynamometer, where they squeeze this hand dynamometer and that measures how strong their grip strength is. They all completed something called the short physical performance battery. And those components include a balance test, a timed walk, and a chair stand. In the chair stand, they have to sit in just a regular chair that they have in their house that has a straight back. And then they're supposed to get up and down 5 times in a row without holding on to the sides of the chair. So that all of that measures how well they are performing functionally. So our research question was, are the barriers to eating and food access associated with these measures of functional status? So again, we were not assessing, nutrients or dietary patterns here. We were assessing, barriers to eating and food access. So I'm going to show you just a few of the results. This was published in the Journal of Preventive Medicine this past fall. And so what this shows is just the distributions of the demographic characteristics, the age, the race ethnicity distributions, their body mass index, and how many women had multi-morbidities, and then across the questions that we asked. So how many ate less than 2 meals a day? How many ate alone most of the time? If they had problems with eating due to tooth and mouth problems, not always able to physically shop, cook, and feed themselves, and then not enough economic resources to purchase food. So you can see, especially with the history of multi-morbidities, quite a few of them, a large fraction, had those, what we called eating barriers. And then I'm just going to show you 2 of the results. First of all, for the question about insufficient resources to purchase food. So they didn't have, these are older women, didn't have enough money to purchase the food. And then we examined whether that was associated with the grip strength, the repeated chair stand, the timed walk, and then the total SPB score, keeping in mind that any score that's less than 10 is not good. And definitely less than 8, there's a significant risk for morbidity and mortality. So these adjusted, I'm going to talk mostly about the adjusted values. They were adjusted for comorbidities, age, race, ethnicity, education, BMI, and other usual suspects. And what we found was that women who said that they had insufficient resources to purchase food, they had low grip strength that was statistically significant. They did poorly on the repeated chair stand, but it wasn't quite statistically significant. They had a poor score on the timed walk, and their score on the overall short performance battery was 7.8. And remember, less than 10 is not good. And that was statistically significant. Not adjusting for all those covariates, still not good. But even after adjustment for all the other things that might lead to a poor score, still not having enough money to buy food resulted in a poor functional status score. We did some additional analyses based on requests from the reviewers of preventive medicine, and they wanted to know if we still adjusted for diet quality. So one of those scores that I showed in the earlier slides, did that still make a difference? And so we went back and we did additional analyses adjusting for the healthy eating index. And it really didn't make too much difference in the results. So they still had a poor grip strength. It was not significant for the repeated chair stand. It lost its significance here for the timed walk, but the magnitude, the effect size is not that different. It went from 0.64 meters per second to 0.65, but it lost its significance. But still, overall, even adjusting for diet quality, these women who did not have enough money to buy food still had a significantly lower total functional score. Then the next result I'm going to show you is for the question, not always able to physically shop, cook, and feed oneself. Some of that might be related to not having enough money to purchase, but could also be related to just challenges of getting around. You know, if you have arthritis, it can be hard to open cans. It could be hard to carry your groceries in. A lot of older women are no longer driving, so it's just hard to get out and get food. And so again, this is something that I would put in the category of a behavior, not necessarily a nutrient or food group or dietary pattern, but an important thing to measure and tells us something that perhaps we need to address. So not always able to physically shop, cook, and feed themselves. We found that there was a marginal, not quite significant association with repeat chair stand. They had a lower timed walk, and again, a lower not good overall score. And then again, adjusting for the total diet quality, there was a marginal association for a poor score on the repeat chair stand, marginal for the timed walk, and the overall score still was significantly lower. So what this told us is that this is an important thing to assess and measure, and perhaps be a target for a future intervention in the elderly. How can we make it easier for them to physically shop, cook, and feed themselves? There's terrific programs like Meals on Wheels that I know has increased substantially during the COVID-19 pandemic, but there's a lot of areas that Meals on Wheels does not service, or for whatever reason, people don't have access to it but this is making a big difference in people's ability to have a good functional status. So some important take-home points from these results is that food access issues are common in elderly women, and even after controlling for age, BMI, race, ethnicity, and history of chronic health conditions, physical difficulties with shopping and cooking and not having sufficient economic resources for food purchases was associated with poor functional status, including poor grip strength, slow timed walk, poor repeat chair stand. And these functional status assessments have been repeatedly shown to be associated with mortality. So the main take-home point is that measuring dietary behaviors and food access, food insecurity can be effectively used to tell us about health parameters. So in summary, from everything I've presented today, is that we all eat. So everyone has an exposure to food. It's not quite like some occupational exposures, where some people might have exposure to a particular environmental exposure, but not everyone. Everyone eats, so everyone has an exposure to food. Nutrients and other compounds from food provide precursors for major metabolic reactions. Assessing food and nutrition is complex. Food and eating is multidimensional. Nutritional status and its relationship to health is influenced by foods, nutrients, and dietary patterns, of course, but it's also influenced by culture, economics, behaviors, eating frequency, and food insecurity. And most of these topics we could not touch on today in just the short time we had together. So I'd like to leave you with some concluding thoughts. One might think that these thoughts and these quotes could have been said today in the 21st century, but these were spoken by Hippocrates, who's known as the father of medicine. And he said, if we could give every individual the right amount of nourishment and exercise, not too little and not too much, we would have the safest way to health. And then finally, I will close with, let food be thy medicine and let medicine be thy food. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Dr. Neuhouser. That was great.
Thank you.
Really, really a lot of information that's going to be very relevant to a lot of us. I don't see any questions on the chat line. Does anybody? Oh, okay. I see here, Teresa Roberts.
I believe that was a clap, not raising.
Oh, it was a clap. Okay.
The little icon. But I'm sorry. If you would like, Dr. McDonald, I had a question for Dr. Neuhouser.
Sure. Go. Yeah. Go.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned in your presentation, Dr. Neuhouser, just the role that culture plays in our diets. So I wanted to ask, here in the United States, are there dietary assessments that are culturally tailored for specific racial groups? Like, for example, like FFQs for Hispanics or for Asian populations?
Yeah, that is a really good question. Thank you for asking it. We have our Fred Hutch FFQ translated into Spanish, but that doesn't necessarily mean that all the items on the FFQ food list would be recognized among Latino populations. There are a few instruments out there. And if you're really interested in this area, we could correspond after today, and I could point you in the right direction. This really is a need to have more culturally appropriate and relevant assessment tools for various populations. It's a huge need.
I see. Thank you. And I see now that we have some questions in the chat, Dr. Neuhouser. So if you believe Dr. Unges wrote a question. Are you able to see it? Or do you want me to read it?
Why don't you read it, Juan Carlos? Why don't you read it?
Okay, I'll go ahead.
Or Dr. McDonald can read it.
Okay, sounds good. So it says, Marian, are there known diet patterns most strongly correlated to mental health and can lead to a positive feedback loop? such as effect of gut microbiota as age increases?
Yeah, this is a very good question. One of the diets on one of my early slides, which I didn't describe in detail, but I mentioned there's something called the MIND diet, and that's being tested by some investigators. I think they are mostly at University of Illinois, Chicago, and Rush University. And they have a study right now going on looking at dietary patterns and cognitive health. I don't think that they have their results out yet. So I think we're kind of in a holding pattern until they can publish their results. Some of the issues with measuring that outcome is there are some standard measures of cognition that are used, but if you restrict it to a study where those measures are only done on people who have cognitive issues, you tend to have a little bit of a biased sample. So ideally, it would be done in a study population where it was a cohort and everyone started out the same, free of disease, and you could follow people over time to see who did develop disease. So I think measuring that outcome is really challenging because in most studies, you're not going to have brain MRIs or other, definitive ways to diagnose. It's going to be, scoring on some of these cognitive measures. So
if I may interrupt really quickly, Marian, I was just wondering more in terms of as the increase of depression with age and how that can affect dietary patterns, perhaps eating less nutritious. That's where I was going.
Okay. So I didn't really answer your question. Sorry, Graciela.
No, that's fine.
Yeah, that is definitely an issue where, it's almost a chicken and egg question because as people get older, they're living alone. They might have a lot of chronic health conditions, which, that can be depressing to anyone. A lot of the medications that older people have to take, they have side effects that affect their appetite. And that can all kind of be a feedback loop of not eating well and then not that feeding into, affect and that kind of thing. So it's hard to know what is leading to what.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I'm trying to keep track of the questions as they come along. I saw that a participant named Sergio raised their hand, so if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask your question, go ahead.
Sure. How these metrics can be related to personal nutrition, which is one of the big things now, the personal nutrition. How all these metrics coming from your research can be related to personalized nutrition?
Yeah, that's a very good question. There is an initiative that NIH is trying to push forward on, they're calling it precision nutrition.
Precision.
So I think that the research is not, that's the research that needs to be done. There was a conference at NIH last month that I participated in. If you're interested in the topic, you could go to the NIH website, just type in precision nutrition and you can watch the presentations, but that's where some of the research needs to go right now to understand, okay, if it's not a one size fits all, what are the questions that we need to ask to understand personalized or precision nutrition? What do we need to measure? And then how do we take that information to tailor recommendations, if that's what the research suggests when all that research is done.
Thank you.
Okay, sounds good. So now getting a question from the chat box, Kim Montoya asks, are findings in male comparative studies similar to that of women for lifelong studies?
Yeah, the Harvard cohorts, which are exclusively in, one of them is exclusively in men, the Health Professionals Follow-Up Study, they have pretty comparable findings. And when there were stratified analyses in our studies, also using the multi-ethnic cohort and the AARP cohort, they were pretty similar. There were some slight differences in the males compared to the females, but in general, the directions were similar.
Sounds good. And Dr. Tomaka, I believe you had your hand raised a while ago. Would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Sure. I'm wondering what information you have about some of the diets that people are using for weight loss or for other reasons, you know, ketogenic diets, paleo, those sorts of things. Are there any good or bad diets within those bunches?
A lot of those, what we call popular diets, so the keto diet, paleo, etc., they don't have a strong research base behind them. So we can't really call them evidence-based. I think that there is some research going on right now to test those, but one thing to keep in mind with any of those very restrictive diets is, first of all, they are very hard to keep up in the long term. And secondly, they are restrictive. So some of those, for instance, one of those, I think paleo diet allows almost no grains. Well, you need grains and you need fiber to keep your microbiome healthy and happy. So any diet that is very restrictive will have problems for keeping someone healthy in the long term. But a lot of the, you know, so-called diets that you might see in popular magazines or on bookshelves or in places where you get electronic books, even if the book says it's read by an MD, chances are it's just somebody's idea that they came up with, and it's not supported by evidence, rigorous evidence.
Interesting. Very
Can I
interesting.
ask another question real quickly? I was choosing between the two and decided I didn't have to choose. What do you know? Is there any research exploring these companies that test your DNA now can create a specified dietary profile for you based on your genetic code? Is there any validity to that notion?
That is not ready for prime time. They are going beyond where the science would be supportive. As part of what this precision nutrition initiative at NIH will investigate, but going to a company now and having them spit out a report for you that says, oh, well, you should eat this and you won't get diabetes, that's beyond what science would currently support.
Okay, so going down the questions in the chat box, the following question asks, what biomarkers would you identify as most appropriate to use in studies to complement dietary quality scores?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the beginning of it. Juan Carlos, could you read the beginning again?
Yeah, of course, I'll read it again. It says, what biomarkers would you identify as most appropriate to use in studies to complement dietary quality scores?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it depends on the research question. Would you be using the biomarkers to solidify the self-report? Like some of what I do in my research is we use the biomarkers as sort of a measure of truth. And then we do some statistical calibrations of the self-report to improve the self-report. Or are you using the biomarkers to be some other aspect of measuring the diet? So I think it depends on the research question and what you're measuring. I have a paper that's under revise and resubmit where we came up with a measure of metabolomics that reflects the dietary patterns, but we'll see if it gets accepted or not. And a few other people have submitted similar papers.
Okay, so I see a participant named Marina has her hand raised. If you'd like to unmute yourself and ask a question.
Hi, Dr. Neuhouser. That was a very interesting presentation. About a year ago, I watched a documentary about cooking street food. And apparently in a lot of these third world countries like India and Thailand, many people will eat street food, which is typically deep fried. But I think mostly the reason behind doing that is to kill a lot of the bacteria and other types of impurities that you'd find in your diet that could really make you very sick. So I guess my question would be, what would you recommend for people who live in these third world countries where they have to choose between potentially eating something that could harm them in the long run with fried foods, for example, versus just, kind of eating something that's not fried and they pose a risk of, developing some type of infection or some form of another type of disease, like a parasite, for example?
Yeah, that's a good question. You can still make foods at home and cook them to an appropriate temperature, and that will kill the pathogen. So for instance, cooking beef to an appropriate internal temperature will kill the E. coli. Cooking poultry to an appropriate internal temperature, doesn't have to be fried, will kill the salmonella. I will mention though that if the pathogen has produced its toxin, because it's not really the pathogen that makes you sick, it's the toxin that the pathogen makes when it gets into your system that usually makes you ill. So if you have some chicken that's not cooked appropriately and the salmonella or whatever the pathogen is has already started to make their toxin, those are often not denatured by heat. So then, you're in a little bit of trouble. I would say that eating street food is not the only way to have foods that are cooked to an appropriate temperature. If someone lives on the street and they don't have access to cooking, then that's another question. If they have even just, a pot over an open fire, that's an appropriate way that they could cook.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I guess I should have started off by saying lots of the people would eat street food because they don't have, kitchens at home, or they don't have ways of actually cooking food. And in like extremely densely populated cities, it's very difficult to actually, cook food up like by fire, as you were saying, to find some area to do that. So yeah, that was just kind of my question in general, but thank you.
Okay, so moving on to the following question in the chat. It says, Dr. Neuhouser, I believe that cardiovascular related diseases are the leading causes of death, even above that of cancer. And I was just curious if you knew if there was anything being done right now to help with this issue that may save more lives from a disease that shouldn't really be killing as many people as it does.
Well, you're quite right that cardiovascular disease is the nation's #1 killer. So there are a number of preventive measures that will lower the risk. And that's why we have consensus committees, we have professional associations all recommending healthy weight, physical activity, and it can be just walking. You don't have to go to a gym or do anything fancy, just, walking, and a healthy dietary pattern. Those things do lower the risk of cardiovascular disease. I will say also that a lot of what has not been mentioned by some of those groups, but they're starting to really pick up on this, is the social determinants of health. In fact, the American Heart Association just this fall came out with, a piece on how that needs to start to be incorporated into, measuring people's health. So we do have some tools in the toolbox to how to reduce risk of cardiovascular disease, but there's more that we need to learn. and understand how to intervene on it at the population level, especially when we think about social determinants of health.
Okay, so next question says, Doctor, what are some available interventions or opportunities for those dealing with chronic conditions related to nutrition?
Was it chronic diseases related to nutrition?
With chronic conditions related to nutrition, yes.
Yeah, so mostly what I talked about was, risk and mortality. Once someone is diagnosed with a condition, sometimes they do have to follow a special diet. So if someone is diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, they're typically, advised some dietary modifications. The same with cardiovascular disease. Once someone is diagnosed with cardiovascular disease, often they are advised to, make some dietary modifications, especially lowering their saturated fat, lowering their sodium. Same for chronic kidney disease. We don't yet have this for cancer, partly because it's not yet funded to, cover nutrition sessions and, nutrition rehab for cancer. So nutrition sessions with a registered dietitian are covered by Medicare and Medicaid and most insurance for some of those other conditions. Some of it is quite individualized depending on a person's particular diagnosis.
Great. So following question. Regarding the final paper results, did you look at whether support systems / isolation moderated the relationship between food access / insecurity and physical test scores?
Yeah, we did not. That's a really good question. We did not look at that type of analysis.
Sounds good. So next question. There is a lot of debate with vitamin D supplements / Cancer Prevention Association. What is your take on this?
You're right. There is a lot of debate on that. There has been, many studies on it, including some that I have led and my team has led. And the preponderance of evidence suggests that taking vitamin D supplements does not prevent cancer. In a well-known trial called the VIAL trial, led by Joanne Manson at Harvard, she showed some subgroup analyses where vitamin D may prevent certain forms of cancer, but the preponderance of evidence has not supported it, even though vitamin D is involved in a number of important reactions, not just bone health, not just skeletal health, but gene transcription and a number of things that are hypothesized to be associated with cancer. Every time we get to these human studies, it's very difficult, and we haven't been able to form a consistent, reliable set of evidence yet.
Okay, great. So next question. How efficient do you believe BMI was / is as a measurement in regard to dietary quality, especially in elderly populations with various health conditions and varying muscle mass, as well as when considering variation in body composition within and between populations? Was the variability with BMI as a measurement system the reason additional functionality tests were given, such as a grip strength test?
Yeah, the grip strength test wasn't given because of variation in BMI. It was just, given overall to anyone who was in the study. BMI is a reasonable measure of body composition, but it's not great. There are certainly much better ways to assess body composition, fat mass, lean mass, bone density, and that would include, DEXA, MRI, even CT, but they're very expensive. So it is a trade-off. BMI is fairly inexpensive to measure because you just have to measure someone's weight and height. Data from our national NHANES show a very good correlation of BMI with DEXA measures, body composition, but some other more recent studies show it to be less well correlated. So it's probably better than just measuring weight alone, because weight will vary by someone's height. Someone who's taller, of course, is going to weigh more. If a study can also measure waist circumference, that's a pretty good predictor of body composition, especially if the abdominal girth is quite large. So, we acknowledge that BMI is not perfect. It certainly is not perfect, but it's very expensive to get imaging in really large studies to determine body composition.
Great question. And as you were providing your answer to that question, I had a question in my mind that came up. So following up on that, would you think that, before I ask the question, with children or youth, their BMIs, they're based on like sex-specific body charts, and they're by percentiles. The BMI classifications are by percentiles. Do you think something like that might help? Something like that implemented with populations over the age of 75, for example, might give a better estimate of BMI rather than just calculating their, height and weight?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think in general, we need more data on the elderly, because we know that once someone reaches, about the age of 70, and certainly by the time they reach the age of 60, the muscle mass decline it just really goes down. And so does the bone mineral density. And sometimes that gets replaced with a proportional increase in adipose, but I'm not sure we can just use the same types of percentile cutoffs the way we do in children. I think we need, probably imaging measures in population-based elderly across the distribution to kind of figure that out. So that's a huge need that we have.
Great, thank you for your response. I see that a participant named Stephanie Rokas raised her hand. If you'd like to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, great presentation. I appreciated it. I do have a question, because I know that the USDA is interested in rethinking their food insecurity instrument. So I'm just wondering, given your findings related to non-financial barriers to food access, and we know that the food insecurity instrument now is really focused on financial resources, if you or anyone on your team is interested in or looking into creating and validating an instrument that measures food insecurity in elderly populations.
Yeah, we haven't quite gotten that far yet, because we just finished this study and published it in the fall. So we have been talking about this. In fact, a number of us, in the Women's Health Initiative have been talking about, how can we find out this information, especially as it relates to COVID, because a lot of these women are more isolated now than they were when we initially sent out these questions. So we're just kind of in those beginning stages of those conversations.
Great, thanks.
Thank you. So I'll go ahead and read a question from the chat box. So the following question says, in response to the current pandemic, we have seen increased federal funding, grants, and resources such as food banks and Meals on Wheels programs. What trends or relationships do you predict to see from the Institute of Women's Study future results, and specific to the food access and insecurity among the elderly?
Yeah, as I mentioned just a moment ago, that's there's a group of us that are working hard to try to come up with some good ways to address these questions, and then we have to find a way to fund that part of the research in WHI related to food access and food insecurity in the Women's Health Initiative. So far, we don't have a way to fund it yet, but we're determined to try to find a way.
Okay, thank you. So I see, Osaseri, you have your hand raised if you'd like to unmute your mic and ask your question.
Thank you very much, Dr. Neuhouser, for this very wonderful presentation. My question is related to like with dietary foods in various ethnic groups. So I'm just wondering if there have been, since we're talking about diseases, cardiovascular, cancer, I'm just wondering if there have been any research that has been done across dietary food in various ethnic groups. Like for example, what are those dietary products that have been able to help a particular ethnic group, like that have been able to protect a particular ethnic group from some certain kind of diseases? I'm just wondering if there has been anything done in this regard. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. And I think the best example I can give for that is work that Dr. Katie Tucker at the University of Massachusetts, now she's at the Lowell campus, has done. And she has led the Puerto Rican health study for a number of years. And a lot of her work and then her subsequent, trainees who've gone on to professor positions, they have investigated dietary patterns in the Puerto Ricans who live in the Massachusetts area, over a number of years. So they have investigated a number of health outcomes, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and a number of things. And they tried as hard as they could to create something that was culturally relevant, at least to the Puerto Ricans. So if you look up her name, it's Catherine Tucker, Tucker, and I would say that she has probably done more in this area than many others.
Okay, great, thank you, Dr. Neuhouser. I don't believe there's any more questions in the chat. So if anybody would want to ask additional questions, feel free to raise your hand.
Dr. Neuhouser, I have a kind of a question. I wonder if, I know you had various meetings with students and faculty today, and you've got a sense of some of the things we're interested in from these questions. Do you have any comments about us or advice for us? Or you I know you have a sense of what stage we're in here. It would be interesting to hear what your take is.
Well, I had an interesting conversation with Dean Cooper, and she was telling me how there's going to be some organizational changes at the university to create this new, college. So that sounded very exciting, and there might be some new and interesting opportunities to explore some new questions and have new collaborations. And, because I initially trained at a land-grant school, I'm a big fan of land-grant schools. And I think having collaborations with, food science and nutrition and health, it's all important because food scientists help provide a safe and affordable food supply, for the population. Do they do really interesting work to help make food shelf stable, to make it healthy so that it doesn't, rot on the package or in whatever the container is. So, working randomly, across is, I think, very beneficial. And I loved meeting with the students, of course, and they all had great questions and loved hearing about their ideas and where they want to go, especially for their next, phase of study.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, we are really looking forward to seeing when and how the college gets off the ground. I think it's going to be offering some great opportunities for us potentially. Well, if there are no other questions, then I think we should thank you again, Dr. Neuhouser, and call a close to the seminar.
I think there's one final question, sorry, or one final individual that has their hand raised.
Eduardo.
That, I don't want to be the last guy asking a question, so thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. It was my great pleasure. I wish I was there in person, but maybe someday when this is all over, we
Definitely.
can do a visit.
Yeah, we'll look forward to that.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank
Thank
you
you
all.
so much.
Please fill out the evaluation. It's the link right at the top of the chat line. It'll just take a minute. Thank you.
Bye.